Okay, so we're doing 3.8 exit ticket, and it says getting to the roots of the problem. Get it? Because we're dealing with roots. And then it says find the roots and write the equation of f of x in standard form. So first, finding the roots, not that difficult. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit just so I can see what my roots are. And I just kind of want to look a little bit clearer. Now, that guy's an in-betweener, so he's not very helpful. This guy looks pretty clear at -2. So there's one of my roots. I'm very positive that this is -2, right? So that's -2. And then I have this guy, which again looks like an in-betweener. So really in this graph, they only gave me one like very clear root at -2. Okay. Yeah. So what happens, Vashanta? What should we do if they only gave us one root? So I'm going to label that. I'm going to say, okay, well, here's my root. It's at -2. Now what do you want me to do? Well, if you give me a root, you've also given me a factor, right? Which in this case is x plus 2. And you know that if I know that it has a factor at x plus 2, then I can find the rest of them by dividing. So I'm gonna divide down here. Let's see, x cubed plus 9x squared plus 11x minus 6. Divide that by x plus 2. So when I'm dividing, it's not going to be a surprise when my remainder is 0. I'm really interested in the answer so I can break down the answer further, finding the rest of my factors and roots, right? I can kind of guess that it's this guy right here, and he looks like he's about like maybe 1/2-ish, and same with this guy, like -8.5, but I can't be for sure, so I'm not going to guesstimate on that. Okay, so then I have x plus 2, so then let me just divide really quick. So I go, oh, this must be x squared. So that would be x cubed, 2x squared. And I'm going to subtract, right? So that means I'm going to change and add my opposites. So here I get 7x squared plus 11x minus 6, right? And then I say, okay, well, x times what gives me 7x squared, and that's plus 7x. And then I multiply and I get 7x times x is 7x squared. 7x times 2 is 14x. And I'm going to subtract, which basically means I'm going to add my opposites. So again, these two cancel, right? It's a 0. 11 minus 14, that's -3x plus 6, right? So then I say x times what gives me -3x, and you're like, oh, it's -3. And then I multiply, so I get -3x plus 6, which I'm excited about because when I add my opposites, these all go away and it's a 0. So I just verified the fact that this is in fact a factor and this is a root. Okay, but what I was really interested in is this guy right here and figuring out how to find the rest of my factors. So I'm looking at this one and I'm like, ugh, right? This one doesn't factor. In case you don't know, I'm thinking of numbers that multiply to get to 3, but add to get to 7, and those numbers don't exist. So now I'm going to use either the quadratic formula or completing the square. For this particular one, I'm probably going to go for the quadratic formula because completing the square, I'd have to divide 7 by 2. And you know, Miss Johnson, she avoids the difficult, you know, fraction, decimal, large number path, if at all possible, because, you know, that's where she makes mistakes. Besides other places. Okay, so I'm going to say x is equal to -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So, oh, it's not showing up, but it is there. So I'm going to use the quadratic formula on this quotient right here. And what I'm hoping for is 2 more factors. And notice my factors, I leave some big space, and you should know why. And if you don't know why, don't worry. Just follow along and you'll see why. Okay. So the very first thing that I do is I copy the whole thing again, except for this time, I put spaces, like parentheses. Right? Okay, so with that being said, once I do that, then I start plugging in what A, B, and C are. So over here, I'm going to plug in, let's see, A is 1, B is 7, and C is -3. Okay. And so once I do that, then I could just plug people in here. And then, one of my high school teachers used to say, this is just plug and chug. So you plug it in and then you chug, which means like you simplify it. So x is equal to -7 plus or minus the square root of 7 squared minus 4 times 1 times -3, all over 2 times 1. And then you say, hey, is there anything that I can simplify? And then you're like, oh yeah, I see. So this is -7. So I'll just write -7. Right? Oh, that's still not catching up. Okay, so then 7 squared is 49. -4 times 1 is -4 times -3 is +12. And I get a 2. So here's my answer. It's going to be -7 plus or minus the square root of, what is that? 61 all over 2. And I'll leave my answer kind of like this, right? So this would be -7 plus root 61 over 2 and -7 minus root 61 over 2, right? Okay, so review really quickly if you're okay with this. And if you're not okay with it, what part of that is like really confusing? Is it the quadratic formula itself? Is it plugging in? Is it simplifying? Which part of this do you not like? Okay, so then what I'm going to do is I still need to write my factors, right? Yeah. So the nice thing here is the quadratic formula works on every single quadratic. That's why I like the quadratic formula. What I don't like about the quadratic formula is that there's a lot of places that Miss Johnson will make a mistake on. So I walk very carefully whenever I do this. So yes, because I couldn't factor, then I jump either to completing the square or quadratic formula. And because this was a 7, I don't want to divide 7 by 2, and that's why I won't choose the completing the square. Okay, so here's my zeros. I'm going to write them up here. So I get -7 plus the square root of 61 over 2, and -7 minus the square root of 61 over 2. So then I say, okay, if that's my 0, if that's my root, how do I find my factor? Right? How do I find my factor? And so I'll just put x minus in front of this whole thing. Because it's a fraction, I'm just going to put x minus in front of it. It's going to kind of look funny. So I'll, number one, I kind of need more space than the little space that I allotted because it's so tight in there. Oh, that's not good. Let me move this guy first. And then I'll move this guy. I just want to move him down so I have more space to write. Okay, so when I write my factors, it's going to look really funny. So here it is again, just because I know that it's too much room that I need to take. So I'm going to write x minus, and then I'm going to put this whole thing in there, right? So I'm going to go -7 plus root 61 over 2. Right, do y'all see that? So if it's -2, then it's x minus -2, which is x plus 2, right? So again, instead of like, It gets a little tricky with fractions and distributing and stuff. So I'm just going to leave it the way I see it. So x minus and putting this whole thing in there. And then my other one is going to be x minus and then putting that whole thing, -7 minus square root of 61 all over 2. Right? So there's my factors. It's not very pretty, is it? It's pretty sloppy and crazy and messy. So I'm just going to review with you really quickly. Number one, they gave me a picture and then they gave me this. If they didn't give me a picture, then yeah, someone said, should I try x plus 1? And they're saying try. And the reason why they're trying it is because they're trying to get to a 6, right? But because they gave me this graph, then they gave me one of my factors. I mean, my roots. So then I wrote a factor and then I divided. When I divided, no surprise, I got a 0 as a remainder. And then I got this quadratic, right? And so then I tried to break up the quadratic and I couldn't factor. So then I used my quadratic formula. And then I took those zeros and stuck them in x minus one of the zeros, x minus another 0. X minus. And this has to do with when you're writing the roots, right? Remember how we said, like, if you go like this, x is equal to -2, right? If x is equal to -2 is your root, what line above that? What is your factor? If this is the root, what is your factor? Right? It's x plus 2. So in reality, it's x minus -2. Yeah. And then also has to do with, remember we talked about how x was in backwards land? So the reason why it's in backwards land is because it has this minus in front, right? So again, this one becomes really sloppy and it's like, not easy. But in reality, it doesn't matter what your roots are, as ugly as they could be, right? Because the form is still, I know, very tiny signs, right? The form is still the same. The form is still the same. So it's that phrase that I like using. It may not always be easy, but it should always make sense. Very good. Good job.